No life raft, no humans, no explanation, just a pair of eyes burning with fatigue barely keeping afloat in the endless blue. Off the coast of Florida, 217 kilometers from land, a lone fisherman spotted something bobbing in the waves. He thought it was debris, until it moved, until it looked at him. The man Caleb Morris, a former Navy handler, had seen a lot of strange things out at sea, but nothing like this. What he pulled onto his boat wasn't just a dog. It was a soldier, a secret, a ghost from a war no one was allowed to remember. This is the story of a German shepherd who swam through death itself and the man who refused to let him disappear again. But what neither of them knew was that by saving each other, they were about to uncover a truth the government had tried very hard to bury. Stay with us, because once you meet Knight, you won't forget him. The sea always knew how to keep secrets, and Caleb Morris had long stopped trying to fight it. The morning was cool when he pushed off from the weather-worn dock, a coffee mug clenched in one hand, tackle box in the other. His old boat, a modest 30-foot center console named Siren's Hollow, groaned beneath him like a beast too tired to rise but too stubborn to die. Just like him. Out past the mangroves and into the open water, the world felt different, quieter, lonelier, but in a way that suited Caleb. He didn't need noise. He needed silence. The kind that lapped gently against the sides of the hull and wrapped around your thoughts like mist. The kind that didn't ask questions. By the time the sun cracked the horizon, the deck was already slick with salt and memory. He had cast his lines, adjusted the motor, and leaned back in the captain's chair with that vacant stare he wore too well these days, not for lack of things to see, but for lack of things he wanted to remember. The ocean, in its stillness, reflected his past too easily. There were mornings it reminded him of the waiting silence before a mission drop back when he wore Navy gear and fear like second skin. And then there were mornings like this, quiet, uneventful, painfully ordinary, the kind that made grief louder. The tackle didn't bite, the bait stayed untouched. And Caleb, he was fine with that. By mid-morning, he had opened a faded paperback novel he had no real intention of finishing. The air was already warming, and the world smelled like diesel, sunblock, and distant thunder. He checked the radar clear. The waters? Still. But something inside him twitched. He didn't know when he'd started relying on instinct again. Maybe it never really left. Maybe it was just dormant like him. But it stirred now, in the silence, in the stillness, a whisper beneath the surface of calm. He sat up, turned down the volume on the old radio, crackling static, scanned the horizon. Nothing. The sun beat down, casting glints of gold off the rolling blue. No ships, no birds, no sign of weather or life. But something didn't sit right. Caleb narrowed his eyes. At first glance, it was just driftwood, a dark, half-submerged blot, dancing with the waves maybe 50 meters out. He was about to let it go. Just another piece of trash carried by the current. Lord knew the ocean was full of it, but it moved again against the tide, not with it. That was enough. Caleb dropped the book, shifted the throttle, and turned the bow toward the shape. The engine grumbled as Siren's Hollow cut through the water, heading toward that odd, stubborn patch, bobbing just below the waves. As he drew closer, the shape became clearer, but the conclusion he reached made less sense. It was moving, not floating. Paddling? His hand shot to the binoculars slung beside the dash, a deep breath, a zoom, A focus. His stomach dropped. It was a dog, a German shepherd, its head barely above water, legs kicking weakly, barely making any progress. The eyes, what little he could make out from this distance, were glassy. The ears slick and pinned. The mouth opened and closed in labored gasps. There was no land in sight, no boat nearby, no wreckage, no reason. Just a lone animal in a place no animal should be. Caleb muttered under his breath, "Jesus." He didn't need time to think. He didn't need logic. He throttled forward. The sun had begun its slow climb toward the ruthless zenith of midday, baking the deck of Siren's Hollow in a glaze of light and heat. The ocean, however, remained unnervingly still. Caleb had seen calm seas before, but this was different. No wind, no birds, not even the whisper of a distant swell. The kind of hush that made old sailors glance at the sky with unease, waiting for something, anything, to break the surface of silence. It wasn't peace. It was the pause before something cracks. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and leaned into the wheel, eyes sweeping the vast, glinting expanse. Nothing. Just an endless sheet of blue stretching in every direction, as if the world had forgotten to rotate for a while. His fingers tapped against the throttle absent-mindedly. Maybe it was the heat. Or maybe it was something else, that old gut feeling, honed through deployments and bad decisions, a ripple under the surface of awareness, telling him something wasn't right. Then he saw it. Just a speck at first, barely noticeable against the shimmer of the water. Something bobbing, caught in the rhythm of the tide, but not drifting like the rest of the ocean's debris. He squinted, shielding his eyes from the sun's glare. From this distance it looked like nothing more than driftwood dark, waterlogged, lifeless. He exhaled slowly and turned his attention back to the sonar. But he couldn't shake it. He glanced back. The shape was still there. Still. Moving? Driftwood didn't move like that. It didn't push forward in jerks. It didn't pause. It didn't fight. Caleb reached for the binoculars. It had been a long time since he used them for anything other than spotting birds on lazy afternoons. He adjusted the focus, heart beginning to thud harder than he cared to admit. There. A flicker. A head? His breath caught. He adjusted again, tracking the shape more closely. It was a head. Dark fur clung tightly to a skull just above the surface. The movement was subtle legs churning beneath the water, but slow, ragged, a desperate rhythm. A dog. No. A German shepherd. Caleb's stomach turned. He scanned the horizon again. No boats, no kayaks, no wreckage. Nothing. Just this animal, in the middle of nowhere, doing something no dog should be doing, surviving. He dropped the binoculars with a clatter and threw the throttle forward. The engine roared as the boat surged through the water, cutting across the glimmering surface. Spray lashed at the windshield, salt air rushing past his face. Caleb's jaw clenched, eyes locked on the figure ahead as it bobbed lower and lower with each wave. "Come on, hold on," he muttered, leaning forward like sheer willpower could close the distance faster. As he neared, the full horror came into focus. The shepherd's body was barely upright. Front legs moved in slow, uneven circles. Every so often, his head dipped below the waterline, then jerked back up, coughing through the choke of the sea. There was no panic in his movements anymore. No barking, no cries, just raw survival, or what was left of it. Caleb's heart pounded. He'd seen this before. In drowning men, in crash survivors lost at sea, that stage where the body keeps moving, but the mind has already let go. He cut the engine hard and coasted the boat up alongside the dog. The silence returned instantly, broken only by the slap of waves against fiberglass and the wet, pitiful rhythm of the shepherd's limbs. "Hey!" Caleb called out, voice firm, urgent. "Hey, stay with me. I got you." The dog didn't respond. His eyes were dull amber, glazed with exhaustion and salt. His mouth hung open, drawing shallow, sputtering breaths. "Damn it!" Caleb yanked off his shirt, tossed a rope ladder over the side, and dove in without thinking. The water was a cold shock, punching the air from his lungs as he surfaced and kicked hard toward the dog. The distance closed in seconds, but it felt like hours. When he reached the animal, the shepherd didn't even react, didn't turn, didn't resist. His legs simply gave out. His body collapsed like a bag of bones into Caleb's arms. He was heavier than expected, soaked and trembling, muscles twitching uncontrollably. Caleb wrapped one arm around the shepherd's midsection, the other clawing at the water to keep them afloat. The dog's fur clung to his skin like seaweed. Every breath he drew like sandpaper scraping through his chest. "You're okay," Caleb grunted. "I got you." The climb back to the boat was brutal. Caleb used the rope ladder to anchor himself, pushing the dog up onto the lower deck with what strength he had left. The shepherd clawed weakly, then collapsed completely onto the planks, chest heaving. Caleb followed, soaked and breathless, crawling to the dog's side. Water drained from the shepherd's mouth. His eyes fluttered. His body shivered, but his chest rose and fell. "You're alive," Caleb whispered. "You crazy, stubborn son of a... You made it." He didn't know how. He didn't know why. But somehow, against every law of nature and logic, the dog hadn't let go, and neither would he. The deck was slick beneath Caleb's knees, and his chest still heaved from the swim, but his eyes never left the German shepherd sprawled in front of him. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch, just lay there, a sodden heap of fur and bone shuddering with shallow breaths. Salt crusted along the edges of his mouth, and his paws were raw, pads rubbed nearly smooth from God knows how long paddling through open water. Caleb leaned in and placed a trembling hand on the dog's side, still breathing, still alive. "Hey," he whispered, voice hoarse, barely audible over the lapping of the waves. "You did good, boy. You held on." The shepherd didn't react. His eyes were half-lidded, glazed over. But there was something there. Not recognition, no. It was too early for that. What Caleb saw wasn't connection. It was endurance, a heartbeat still refusing to quit. He moved quickly, shedding the rest of his soaked gear and grabbing a dry tarp from the emergency kit near the console. He wrapped it around the dog's body, layer by layer, trying to preserve whatever warmth was left in those bones. The fur beneath was tangled and matted with salt, but Caleb worked gently, fingers brushing across the shepherd's shoulders, neck, and ribs. There was almost nothing to him, all muscle and sinew, no fat. And yet, beneath the ribs, that steady thump of life remained. Caleb reached for a bottle of fresh water and unscrewed the cap, tilting it slowly toward the shepherd's lips. At first, nothing. Then the dog's tongue flicked, barely wetting itself. A few seconds passed. Another lick. "That's it," Caleb breathed. "Come on. That's it." The dog took in maybe half a mouthful, then stopped. Rested. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Caleb sat beside him, soaked to the bone, staring out at the endless blue. The stillness had returned, but now it pressed heavier on his shoulders, as if the ocean itself were watching, waiting, daring him to ask the question burning in his chest. What were you doing out here? There were no answers. Not yet. But there were signs. No collar, no harness, no tags, just a small, corroded shard of metal tangled in the thick fur near the neck. Caleb's fingers brushed against it. He gave a gentle tug and pulled it loose. It was the remnant of a dog tag, the engraving worn thin by sea and time. Only one character still legible, K. That was it. No number, no name, just a letter. Caleb turned it over in his hand. What the hell are you, boy? The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of salt and diesel. The waves slapped gently against the hull, but inside, Caleb felt a current rising. Something bigger than just a rescue. Something that didn't belong 300 kilometers from shore. He looked back down at the shepherd. The dog's breathing was more rhythmic now. Still shallow, but steadier. His eyes had closed, not unconscious, just resting. Trusting, perhaps, or simply too tired to fear. You weren't meant to be found, were you? Caleb murmured. Someone left you out there. On purpose. The thought made his jaw tighten. He'd seen men abandoned before. On missions gone wrong, on paperwork that got conveniently misplaced. But this was something else. Cold. Calculated. Cruel. And yet, this dog had made it. Through everything. Through open ocean. Through hunger. Through muscle fatigue so deep it should have drowned him. But he didn't drown. He swam. He chose life. Caleb reached out and brushed a hand gently along the dog's side. The shepherd stirred, but didn't move away. That's some fight you've got in you, he said, voice rough, heavy with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Respect, maybe even awe. The sky above began to shift, the sharp light of noon softening into the warmer tones of early afternoon. Caleb stood, checked the course, and turned the bow toward shore. The marina was at least 2 hours out, but they'd make it. He glanced back once more at the bundle on the deck, wrapped in tarp, still breathing, still here. That image would stay with him longer than he realized. A dying dog collapsed in silence, but alive, too tired to move, too stubborn to die, a warrior adrift, and maybe, just maybe something more. The boat rocked gently beneath them, an old vessel creaking like bones settling after too many years on the move. The engine hummed at idle, propped steady in the water, but inside, Caleb Morris, something far less stable churned. He sat cross-legged on the deck, one hand resting lightly on the soaking wet tarp he had wrapped around the dog. The German shepherd lay on his side, eyes closed but not unconscious, not gone. His breathing was faint but regular now. His legs twitched once, involuntary, the way muscles spasm when pushed past breaking. Caleb didn't flinch. He'd seen that look before in the eyes of rescued men, half drowned and half alive. Soldiers who came back in body, but hadn't yet decided if they'd brought their soul with them. Caleb leaned forward and gently adjusted the tarp again, tucking it around the dog's midsection. The thick fur was clumped and matted, every strand reeking of sea salt and survival. "You're one stubborn bastard," he said softly. "Didn't quit, huh? Damn near 300 clicks from land, and you're still breathing." The dog didn't react. No tail wag, no ear twitch, not even a shift in his shallow breathing. But the stillness felt deliberate, not limp, not empty, more like a soldier in stasis, like he was conserving what little strength remained for something more important than responding to comfort. Caleb ran a hand gently along the shepherd's flank. That's when he noticed it, just beneath the leg, near the chest, where the tarp had pulled back slightly. The skin there was raw, not from injury, not a wound, friction, from hours, maybe longer, of paddling through salt water, every stroke carving away a little more of the flesh. Caleb swallowed hard, voice catching in his throat. Jesus, you didn't just fall in, did you? The raw patches were symmetrical, rubbed down to red and pale skin in perfectly mirrored spots, just where a tactical harness might have sat, or ropes, or restraints. But now there was nothing left, just the damage, and the dog still here to wear it. Caleb sat back on his heels and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. This wasn't an accident, he muttered, wasn't some boater's mistake. The words hung in the air like oil on water, ugly, undeniable. The shepherd stirred slightly at the sound of his voice. One eye fluttered, then eased open just a sliver. Amber, clouded but watchful. There was no fear in that eye. No trust either. Just calculation and exhaustion. Caleb shifted closer and poured a tiny bit of fresh water into a small tin bowl from his gear kit. He nudged it gently toward the dog's muzzle. "Try again," he whispered. "Even just a lick." The shepherd made no move for a long moment. But then a flick of the tongue, cautious, brief. A pause, another, not drinking, just checking, as if deciding whether this, too, was a trick. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. Not pity, something heavier. He wasn't looking at a pet. Not someone's lost dog who slipped off a boat. This was something else entirely. The stillness, the silence, it all screamed training, discipline, trauma. "You're not a stray," he said quietly, more to himself than anything. "You're not out here by accident." He leaned back and studied the dog's posture. Even collapsed, he wasn't sprawled like a creature who'd given up. His limbs were tucked in close, his head facing the entry to the lower deck like he was watching for threats, even as his body gave out. This was a dog who had been taught not just to obey, but to survive. The boat continued its slow trek toward the mainland, the water sparkling around them in cruel contrast to the weight on deck. Caleb's hand found the crumpled metal shard again, the broken tag he'd pulled from the dog's fur. Just a single letter etched into the rusted surface. K. He rolled it between his fingers, glancing back at the shepherd. "K," he said softly. "That your name? Or just the first letter they gave you before the mission went to hell?" The dog didn't respond, but his eye, the one that was still open, shifted, slightly, toward the sound. "I'll take that as a maybe," Caleb whispered. He didn't know what kind of hell this animal had been through, or who had put him out there in the first place. But he knew one thing, this dog wasn't disposable. Someone had treated him like gear, like a ghost, like something that could be turned off and tossed away when the job was done. But he had made it, and that mattered. Caleb sat beside him in silence for a long time, the sun warming the back of his neck, the dog's breathing slow and measured beside him. Every so often the shepherd twitched, as if fighting waves in his sleep. "I don't know what they did to you," Caleb murmured, "but I'm not going to let them finish it." The wind picked up just enough to rustle the edge of the tarp. The dog didn't flinch, and for Caleb, That was enough for now. The marina came into view just after 4 p.m., a weathered sliver of pilings and forgotten boats hugging the shoreline like a ghost town clinging to relevance. The old fuel dock hadn't been repainted in years, and the wooden signs swung in the breeze, their letters sun-bleached and fraying. Caleb didn't care. He wasn't here for convenience. As he steered Siren's Hollow into the slip, the German shepherd beside him gave no sign of acknowledgement, still wrapped in the tarp, still lying in that strange posture guarded even in collapse. Only his eyes moved, tracking faint shapes beyond the boat's edge. Caleb cut the engine and knelt beside him. "All right, buddy," he murmured, brushing a hand across the dog's matted fur. "Time to get you seen." The shepherd didn't blink, but his tail, still soaked and limp, thudded once against the deck. It was the first voluntary motion since the rescue. Getting him into the truck wasn't easy. The dog was heavy, more so in his current condition, dead weight and dense with seawater. Caleb lifted him slowly, one arm cradled beneath the chest, the other securing the hips. Knight didn't protest, didn't growl or resist. He simply let himself be carried, as if trusting this one act of human contact to carry him forward. He laid him gently across a folded blanket in the back seat, cracked the window, and started the engine. There were 3 veterinary clinics between the dock and his cabin. He passed them all without slowing. Too commercial, too visible. Instead, he took a winding turn off the main road, gravel crunching beneath the tires as the truck rolled toward a small hand-painted sign, Clearwater Animal Haven. It wasn't fancy, but it was private, and the woman who ran it, Dr. Anika Reyes, had a habit of helping the hopeless. The bell above the door gave a soft chime as Caleb stepped inside, carrying the bundle of wet tarp and fur in his arms. The receptionist, a young girl with auburn braids and a stack of clipboards, looked up with wide eyes. "Sir, He almost drowned," Caleb cut in, voice low but firm. 180 miles out. No ID, no collar, just this." He reached into his pocket and held up the rusted metal tag. The receptionist's breath caught. "Oh, my God." A door swung open behind her, and Annika stepped into the room, wiping her hands on a towel. Mid-30s, sharp-eyed, and usually unshakable. But when she saw the dog, something faltered in her expression. "Put him on the table," she said, already moving toward the back. Caleb followed, laying the shepherd onto a clean examination surface. The room was small, sterile, but warm in the way only old buildings and good people could be. Annika snapped on gloves and began checking vitals. Heart rate, pupil response, hydration. "Dehydrated," she murmured. "Exhausted, obvious muscle trauma, raw friction wounds under the axilla front leg pits." She paused. "From what? Swimming?" Caleb nodded. "For how long?" "Hours, maybe more." Anika stopped, stared at him. "Where exactly did you find him?" "Drifting in open water," he said quietly. "No land in sight, no boats, no wreckage. Just him." She examined the skin under Knight's fur, ran a scanner across his neck. No chip. Of course not. No collar. "And you said this was all he had?" She pointed to the jagged metal in his hand. Caleb nodded and handed it to her. She turned it over under the light. Most of the engraving had been eaten away by salt and rust. Only one character remained. K. "That could mean anything," she muttered. "Kennel code? Military designation? Maybe even an experimental tag." She looked at Caleb. "But it's not a civilian dog tag. Not one I've ever seen." Caleb folded his arms across his chest, staring at the dog who lay breathing slow and steady on the table. He didn't just fall overboard. You know that, right? Annika nodded. I believe you, but believing isn't proof. You planning on reporting this? He shook his head. No animal control, no press, no agencies. She arched an eyebrow. That's not the usual response. I'm not the usual person, he replied, and something in his tone made her stop asking. She turned back to the dog, checked his vitals once more, then covered him with a fresh, heated blanket. He's stable for now. I'll start an IV to get his fluids up. Antibiotics, too. No internal bleeding, no organ trauma. Honestly, it's a miracle. Caleb exhaled slowly, tension easing from his shoulders for the first time since morning. Thank you. He's lucky you found him, Annika said, taping the IV into place. Caleb shook his head. No. He's lucky he didn't give up before I did. They stood in silence for a moment. The kind of silence that isn't empty, just full of things that don't need saying yet. The cabin wasn't much. Just a single-story structure tucked behind a curtain of longleaf pines and Spanish moss, with weather-beaten siding and a porch that creaked under the weight of silence more than footsteps. But it was home, or at least the closest thing to it Caleb Morris had let himself have in years. The pickup rumbled down the dirt path leading up to the cabin, headlights slicing through the dusk like a memory trying to break free. The sun had long dipped behind the tree line, casting everything in that deep, lingering blue that made the world feel both softer and lonelier. Knight didn't make a sound in the back seat. He hadn't the entire ride. Caleb glanced at the rearview mirror. The dog lay curled in the blanket Annika had wrapped him in. Still. Quiet. His body trembled every now and then, not violently, just little aftershocks of cold and exhaustion still lingering in his bones. But his eyes were open now, watching. Not the windows, not the trees. Caleb. Inside, the cabin smelled like pine wood, salt air, and yesterday's coffee. The furniture was minimal functional but lived in. A stone fireplace in the corner still held the charred memory of a fire Caleb hadn't bothered to light in weeks. He carried Knight in carefully, cradled like a wounded soldier more than a dog. The shepherd's weight felt different now, less like dead weight, more like something heavy with meaning, something that hadn't let go. Caleb laid him on a folded quilt in the center of the room, right near the base of the fireplace. The blanket dipped under the weight of the dog's frame, molding to him like it had been waiting there all along. A bowl of fresh water was set down nearby. A small dish of boiled chicken breast, nothing too rich, just enough to say, "You made it this far. Here's something real." Caleb knelt, hands on his knees, eyes level with the dog's. "You're safe now," he said quietly. 3 words. No sermon. No promises. Just enough to plant a seed. Knight didn't move. But his eyes, they didn't close, didn't flick away. They just looked at him. Not searching for commands, not pleading for rescue, just watching, like a soldier scanning a new battlefield. The rest of the night unfolded slowly. Caleb moved around the cabin with the quiet economy of someone who'd learned to live without making noise. He changed into dry clothes, brewed a pot of tea instead of coffee, tossed another log into the fireplace but didn't light it. He didn't want to spook the dog with crackling heat, not yet. Not until he understood what Knight had been through. Some scars didn't show up under X-rays. Some lived in firelight and sound. Outside, a breeze picked up, swaying the pines in low, rustling patterns, the kind of wind that usually put Caleb to sleep. But not tonight. He found himself sitting cross-legged near the dog a few feet away, not touching, just being there. Knight hadn't moved since being laid down. His breathing had evened out, but his ears stayed slightly perked, twitching with every creak, every gust, every shift in the cabin's skeleton. The chicken remained untouched, the water barely lapped. But the dog hadn't looked away once. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low and steady. "I don't know who you belong to," he said. "I don't know why they left you out there, but I know what it's like to be left behind." The fire remained unlit, the room dim. "I've seen good men cut loose because they were inconvenient, broken, useful one day, discarded the next." He exhaled. "I don't know if you were a tool to them or a partner, but I know what I see now." He didn't finish the thought. Didn't need to. Night shifted slightly, barely. A faint realignment of his shoulders under the blanket, not enough to mean much, but then slowly, almost imperceptibly, one eye blinked. Not in fear, not in exhaustion, just once, slow, deliberate. Caleb froze. He'd seen that before. In men too tired to talk but still willing to listen. In soldiers half gone but not quite lost. It was the smallest thing, but it meant everything. He smiled. Not a big one, just the faintest curve at the edge of a man who'd forgotten how to mean it. "Yeah," he whispered. "I see you too." Hours passed. Caleb stayed nearby, eventually curling up in the old recliner across from the fireplace, one eye still open. Night didn't sleep in the way most animals do. He didn't sprawl or sigh. He simply lay still, recharging, not resting. But at some point during the early hours, he adjusted his weight ever so slightly, so his body faced toward the chair, toward the man who hadn't asked anything of him, just given him a second chance. The wind outside eased, and the first light of dawn pressed against the cabin windows. And inside, for the first time in a long time, both of them stayed. Morning crept into the cabin like a whisper, slow, pale, reluctant. The light filtered through warped wooden blinds and spilled in hazy stripes across the floor, illuminating the dust motes that drifted like memory fragments through the air. Outside, the wind had quieted. The ocean beyond the tree line exhaled a steady rhythm. And inside, for the first time in days, there was motion. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, a soft rustling on the quilt, a shift of weight, the low sound of nails brushing against hardwood. Caleb stirred from the recliner, eyes blinking into the morning blur. At first he wasn't sure what had pulled him from sleep. Then he saw it. Night was standing, not fully, not steadily, but he was up, back legs trembling, front paws planted like uncertain roots, eyes fixed on something across the room. The bowl. The same untouched chicken from the night before. Caleb sat forward slowly. He didn't say a word, just watched. Night took a step, careful, quiet, almost too quiet. Another step, then a pause. His nose hovered just above the dish, breath visible in the morning chill. And then he ate. Not voraciously, not like a stray, but controlled, methodical. A few pieces at a time, chewed, swallowed, paused. No sounds of desperation, no frantic gulping, just measured, practiced need. Caleb let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "There you go," he murmured. "First win of the day." Night didn't look at him. He just continued, slow and steady, as if his body still remembered what it meant to ration. The moment was quiet, but heavy. A man watching a dog reclaim something he'd almost lost. An hour later, Night was still on his feet, not walking much, just standing, occasionally sitting near the door, then shifting toward the window. always facing the exits, always observing. There was something in his movements too precise, too deliberate, not the aimless wandering of a recovering dog, no sniffing, no barking, no circling like most canines in a new space. Knight moved like someone taught him to memorize a room before trusting it. Caleb watched from the kitchen counter, mug of black coffee in his hand, steam curling into the morning air. He didn't speak, didn't interfere, just watched the way Knight watched. Every step had intention, every pause was a calculation. He didn't flinch at the sound of the kettle hissing, didn't react when a car passed distantly on the road. But when a hawk shrieked from a tree just beyond the cabin, Knight froze, not out of fear, out of awareness. Body low, eyes fixed, ears trained. A tactical stillness, like he'd once been trained to listen for things that didn't belong. By noon, Caleb had laid out another meal-boiled eggs and shredded chicken. He placed it near the fireplace, then sat across the room with a sketch pad he hadn't touched in years. Knight approached more confidently this time, still silent, still focused. As the dog ate, Caleb caught himself noticing every detail. The slight limp in the left rear leg, the healed-over scar under the right eye, the places on his chest where fur had thinned from too many hours in salt and sun. The raw patches had scabbed over, healing with slow defiance. This wasn't a pet. This was a survivor. More than that, this was a dog trained to stay alive under circumstances that would kill most men. And yet, here he was, standing on 4 legs, swallowing food one bite at a time, watching the man who rescued him with cautious interest. After the meal, Knight didn't return to the quilt. He sat at the corner of the room, just beside the wood stove, where he could watch every entrance, front door, kitchen hall, windows. He didn't sleep. He just sat, like a sentinel, like he'd done this before. Caleb finally spoke again around dusk, voice low. "You're not just some cast-off, are you?" Knight's ears flicked, but he didn't move. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You're too quiet, too focused. The way you eat, the way you move. That's not instinct, that's training." He stood, walked over to the edge of the rug, and crouched slowly far enough not to corner the dog, close enough to offer space. Knight looked at him, not through him, at him. No tail wag, no panting, no trust, but no fear either, only assessment. Caleb nodded slowly. "You're reading me like I'm reading you." A small silence stretched between them. "You were someone's weapon," he said, almost gently, "and they threw you away when they were done." He paused. "Well, I'm not done." Knight didn't blink, but in his eyes, amber, cracked with fatigue, something shifted. Not emotion, but presence. As if for the first time Knight was acknowledging that he'd been seen, and maybe, just maybe, that he hadn't been left behind for good. It had been 3 days since the rescue, and Caleb had seen enough to know this wasn't a regular dog. Knight never barked, not once. Not at the sound of passing cars, not at the creak of the back door when the wind pushed it open, not even when a raccoon knocked over the trash bin behind the cabin sometime after midnight. Most dogs would have charged the door, tail up, throat full of sound. Knight simply stood, ears forward, body still tracking the movement with his eyes first. Only his breathing shifted, shallow, quiet, calculated. And when the moment passed, he sat back down, silent as stone, like he was trained not to give away position. Caleb had seen this kind of posture before, just not in dogs. It was late morning, and the sun spilled across the floorboards in long golden bands. Caleb sat on the porch steps, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching night through the open door. The dog wasn't wandering the house like animals do when they're curious or restless. He wasn't sniffing furniture or chasing shadows. He moved with intent, step by step, checking each room once, then again, then positioning himself where he could see everything. He wasn't exploring, he was clearing the space. Caleb narrowed his eyes, memories stirring beneath the surface like mud pulled from the bottom of still water. When he was in active service years ago, younger, angrier, he'd worked with Navy canine units, not just any dogs, dual-certified specialists, the kind trained to track narcotics in the morning and deploy with special forces by dusk. Dogs that knew how to rappel from helicopters. Dogs that followed silent hand cues, not leashes. Dogs that never barked unless ordered to. Dogs like this. Night crossed from the far corner of the living room to the window beside the kitchen. His gait was smooth, head low, tail level, not tucked, not wagging, controlled. He paused near the doorframe, then sat. Not on the rug on the cold floor, not for comfort, but for vantage. Caleb stepped inside, leaning quietly against the wall. You didn't learn that from chasing tennis balls. Knight's ears flicked, but he didn't look. You clear rooms. You sit near exits. You don't eat unless the bowl's placed perpendicular to the wall. Caleb tilted his head. I know what you are. The dog finally turned. Amber eyes, alert, intelligent, not aggressive, not submissive, just present. Caleb crouched, not too close, one knee down, one foot flat, the way handlers do when giving space but asserting calm. I worked with dogs like you in Fallujah, he said. We dropped with them at night, silent inserts, breach and clear. One signal and they moved before the rest of us. Knight didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. There was this Belgian, Aries, had a scar across the muzzle like someone carved a map into him, saved more men than I could count, never barked, never flinched, just waited for the right moment. He looked into Knight's eyes. You've got that same stare. Knight shifted slightly, just enough to reposition, paw sliding across the floor for balance. Still silent. Still. Caleb rose and walked to the kitchen. He pulled a slice of cooked chicken from the fridge, broke off a piece, and tossed it onto the floor near Knight. Most dogs would have pounced. Knight looked at it, waited, made sure Caleb had backed away before taking 2 steps forward and calmly eating it. No tail wag, no sound, just execution. That night, Caleb set out a second bowl of water this time, just outside the cabin door, near the edge of the porch. He sat in the rocker nearby, moonlight flickering through tree limbs like scattered Morse code. Night emerged a minute later. He didn't rush, didn't sniff the air like a dog looking for predators. He just walked forward, paused, drank once, then turned to face the woods. Why don't you ever relax? Caleb asked, voice half lost in the wind. You're safe now. Knight didn't turn around. You know that, don't you? The shepherd sat, not beside him, beside the doorway, guarding, watching. And in that moment, Caleb knew exactly what kind of animal he'd brought home. Not a stray, not a victim, not even just a survivor. This was a soldier, and soldiers never stop scanning the perimeter. The phone call lasted less than a minute. No long explanations, no dramatic build-up, just a name, A time and the kind of pause that only meant one thing between men like Caleb and Jasper Kane. Something's not right. By 2 p.m., a truck rolled down the gravel road behind Caleb's cabin, crunching slow and steady like it didn't want to announce itself. Knight heard it before Caleb did. He was lying in the far corner of the room, back to the wall, head resting on crossed paws. But the moment the engine hit the edge of audible range, Knight's ears lifted, body rigid but not startled. Just prepared. Caleb stepped onto the porch and waited. The truck came into view. Flat black, old Ford, paint dulled by salt air and sun. Jasper Kane stepped out, tall and lean, his posture still military, even if his beard had gone gray. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just closed the door gently and looked toward the open cabin door. Caleb met him halfway. "Inside?" Jasper asked, voice low. "Yeah," Caleb nodded. "I didn't tell him you were coming." Jasper didn't reply. He didn't need to. Inside, the room fell into a silence thicker than before. Jasper stepped into the doorway and paused, letting his eyes adjust to the dim. Knight was still in the corner, still watching. No growl, no movement, just steady amber eyes tracking every breath in the room. Jasper didn't speak. He just walked 3 steps inside, slow, deliberate. Then he stopped. Caleb stood to the side, arms crossed, not interfering, just bearing witness. Jasper knelt slowly, one knee on the floor, eyes never leaving Knight's. Then, without a word, he raised his right hand fingers, extended palm facing down. The room held its breath. He moved the hand down slightly, slow and curved, like pressing invisible air. Knight moved. He didn't hesitate, didn't question, just responded, dropped into a low crouch, tail level, shoulders square, then froze, awaiting further instruction. Jasper didn't blink. He shifted posture, turned his hand at a 45-degree angle, and gave 2 subtle taps to his chest. Knight adjusted. One paw forward, slight weight shift, head lower, defensive posture, not submission, readiness. Caleb exhaled, barely audible. "Jesus," he whispered. "That's a Tier 1 response set." Jasper nodded, slowly standing. "Silent ops. These aren't civilian patterns. He's had tactical conditioning. Extensive." Knight hadn't moved from the crouch, but now his gaze flicked to Caleb, as if awaiting orders, or waiting to see if they were safe. Jasper turned to Caleb. "Where'd you find him?" Caleb's voice was gravel. "Out there, alone, 200 miles off the coast. No boat, no collar, just a rusted tag with a K on it." Jasper frowned, processing. "They don't tag civilian dogs like that." "No chip," Caleb added. "No ID, no scar where one used to be." Jasper stepped forward cautiously, crouched again, and extended a flat palm, this time upward. Not a command, a request. Knight stared at the hand. Then, after a pause, he placed one paw into Jasper's palm. No trembling, no anxiety, just a precise, practiced motion, like he'd done it before, for someone else. Jasper glanced up. "You didn't just rescue a dog, Caleb." "I know. You pulled a soldier out of the ocean." A silence settled over the room. Knight sat back on his haunches, body still loose but alert, as if listening to a frequency no one else could hear. Jasper rose. "Whatever mission he was on, it wasn't civilian, and it sure as hell wasn't sanctioned. Someone trained him for black work. Offshore deployment, remote command, full field response. He walked toward the kitchen, opened the old fridge without asking, grabbed a bottle of water. Caleb didn't stop him. "He's not just trained," Caleb said. "He's disciplined beyond anything I've ever seen." Jasper took a sip and leaned against the counter. "Which means he wasn't lost by accident." Caleb nodded. "They left him." They both looked at Night now, lying again near the door, one eye half-lidded but still tracking, still processing, still waiting. That night, after Jasper had gone, Caleb sat near the edge of the bed with the rusted tag in his palm. The letter K had nearly faded, but now it meant something different. Not an initial, not a serial, a ghost, from a mission no one wanted to admit ever happened. He looked over at Night, curled near the front door, back against the wall. No leash, no command, just loyalty, still intact, still choosing to stay. The cabin was quiet, too quiet for sleep. Outside, the wind had shifted again, not loud, but persistent, the kind of breeze that made trees creak and porch chimes shudder. Caleb Morris sat alone at the worn kitchen table, a chipped ceramic mug of cold coffee in one hand and a rusted tag in the other. Just that. A single, stubborn letter clinging to metal like a secret, too afraid to disappear completely. Across the room, Night slept, but only technically. His body was curled near the front door, still as ever, but Caleb could tell he wasn't fully under. One ear flicked at every creak in the wood, every low groan of wind pressing against the cabin frame, still listening, still trained, still alert. Caleb set the mug down and stood slowly. His knees popped in protest as he moved toward the coat closet tucked between the hallway and the back door. The knob stuck like always, but he gave it a short jerk, and it opened with a tired sigh. At the very back, beneath a folded camo poncho and an old diving harness, sat a battered black Pelican case, dust-coated and sealed with twin latches. He hadn't touched it in years. Didn't plan to. But this wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was instinct, the kind that didn't knock it broke down the door. He set the case on the kitchen table, turned it toward himself, and popped the latches. The old military-issued Panasonic Toughbook still sat inside sand-scuffed, power-charged by a long-forgotten solar bank buried beneath the foam padding. Next to it were 2 flash drives, a notched cable converter, and a stack of laminated clearance codes. Caleb stared at it all for a long moment. Then he flipped open the laptop. The screen blinked to life, slow, humming like an exhausted heart trying to remember how to beat. The system asked for his security token. He plugged in the black fob, pressed his thumb to the biometric reader, and waited. Access granted. He wasn't sure what he expected. Guilt, maybe. Resistance. Some part of him to flinch at going back in. But all he felt was a kind of cold familiarity, like slipping back into old boots you never meant to wear again. The interface was dated but functional. A secure shell over a stripped-down OS military grade, preloaded with decommissioned links and a single access point to a buried Navy ops database. He typed slowly, fingers a little stiffer than he remembered, but muscle memory did most of the work. Retired. Special tier. Black Sector 3, Delta. He entered his override code, the one he swore he'd never use again. 1 beat, 2, override accepted. The menu expanded, hidden branches unfolding like the spine of a file never meant to see daylight again. He exhaled slowly. "Let's find out who you were," he muttered. Search parameters. Canine unit, military grade breed, German Shepherd Identifier, K, partial status, presumed lost or terminated location, East Coast deployment. He hesitated for just a second before hitting enter. The screen blinked. Loading. Then something flashed red. Restricted file, level 5. Clearance required, operation silent echo. The name alone sent a chill through him. He didn't know what it meant. But something about the phrasing, the words silent and echo together, felt too intentional, like something designed to vanish, something buried so deep it didn't even cast shadows. He clicked again. Access denied. He leaned back in his chair, ran a hand down his face, tried to ignore the way his pulse had started climbing. Then, without thinking too long, he pulled out the laminated sheet from the case, an old set of contingency overrides issued only to those involved in Blackwater asset recovery operations. Long expired, technically illegal now, but some ghosts didn't obey expiration dates. He entered one of the legacy codes. The system paused. Verifying. Another pause. Then, partial access granted. The file opened. Just a few lines, no photos, no names, just bare data. Asset ID K9K. Breed, German Shepherd. Sex, male assignment, offshore, recon, deep field nav. Handler, redacted deployment zone, classified operational status. Decommissioned termination. Date, 3 days ago. Final status, presumed lost at sea. No recovery protocol initiated. Caleb stared at the screen, not because he was surprised, but because it confirmed everything he'd already begun to fear. They knew. They knew Knight had gone overboard, or been left, and they hadn't tried to recover him, hadn't even listed him as active. He wasn't missing. He was written off, a disposable asset, a silent ghost. And yet, he lived. Across the room, Knight stirred. Caleb turned, still staring at the dog in the shadows. "You weren't supposed to come back," he whispered. "But you did." Knight opened one eye, didn't move, but that gaze, that quiet, unreadable focus, locked on the screen like he could sense the past bleeding back in. Caleb looked down at the last line of the file. Notes. Mission failure. Subject compromised. Termination mandatory. A long silence followed. Then, under his breath, Caleb said, "They tried to erase you." And for the first time, a low growl rumbled from Knight's chest. Not loud, not angry, just awake. The file was thin. Caleb stared at the blinking cursor in the corner of the screen, the words on the monitor glowing pale green against the black military-issue interface. Operation name, Silent Echo. Asset ID, K9K. Breed, German Shepherd assignment, offshore recon. Deep field navigation handler, redacted. Last active entry, 3 days ago, final status, terminated. Due to compromise notes, no recovery protocol initiated. That was it. No debrief, no location log, no chain of command report. Not even a last handler note. Just a line that read more like a footnote in a black ops journal than the death certificate of a living, breathing operative. Terminated. As if the dog was a piece of broken equipment. Caleb leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen like it might blink and tell him he'd misunderstood. But the words didn't change. They'd known. 3 days ago, right before he found Knight, someone in the system had logged him dead. No retrieval order, no distress beacon, no protocol for tracking or recovery, just compromise in bold letters. And then silence. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant. Then, one by one, he typed, "View additional files. Silent echo access denied." Of course. He entered a second override, one from a rescue dive op he'd assisted in off the Horn 2 decades ago, old, almost certainly expired. But the screen blinked again. Partial access granted. What loaded next wasn't a formal document. No briefing slides, no GPS logs, no standard dossier, just a string of plain text fragments like pieces of a puzzle someone tried to shred before the hard drive went cold. He read slowly, line by line. Project initiated 5 years ago in cooperation with advanced K9 conditioning protocols developed for unmanned recon substitutes. Goal: to create biologically autonomous recon agents capable of deep field navigation, maritime infiltration, and nonverbal return command execution. Phase 3. Animal Asset Profile. K9K. Breed: German Shepherd. Temperament: suppressed vocal response. Cognitive index: high. Pattern recognition: nonverbal retention. Specialized behaviors: room clearing, scentless tracking, stress-activated memory trigger. Handler: pairing, classified deployment method. Airdrop, subsurface launch, SEAL assisted. Status after mission number 11. Memory response abnormal. Refusal to re-engage handler. Subject deviated from return protocol. Last sighting: untracked movement in open water. Termination order issued 16 hours later. Caleb's hand gripped the edge of the table, hard enough that his knuckles whitened. Refusal to re-engage. A K9 unit turning away from its handler in the field. That didn't happen. Not unless something had gone very, very wrong. Stress-activated memory trigger. He whispered it under his breath, reading it again. They didn't just train Knight to obey. They trained him to remember, to observe, to carry intel, not on a drive, not in a chip, in his mind. If Knight had seen something out there, something that triggered a deviation, it meant he didn't malfunction. He made a choice to break protocol, a choice to survive. Caleb sat back, the screen still glowing in the dark. Somewhere behind him, the floor creaked. He turned. Knight was standing just inside the hallway, watching him. Not in fear, not in confusion, but with the same gaze Caleb had seen on operatives who knew more than they could say, who had been in too deep and brought something back with them they weren't supposed to. Caleb looked down at the tag on the table, the one they'd ripped off him, or that he'd torn free himself. Just a K. No name, no honor, just an asset designation, something to delete when the mission got messy. He closed the file, shut the laptop gently, and exhaled. "You weren't just a part of something," he said softly, eyes on Knight. "You were the thing they wanted to forget." Knight didn't move, but his head tilted barely, like he understood, like he remembered everything. The screen had gone dark. Caleb hadn't touched the power button. It just blinked off. He stared at it for a long moment, heart thudding not with fear, not yet, but with the steady beat of an old muscle waking up, the instinct to move, to prepare. Something about the way the file closed. No error message, no confirmation, no log-out prompt. Just a black screen, like it had seen enough, like someone else had too. Caleb slowly closed the laptop, fingers pressing down until the latches clicked shut. Across the cabin, Knight still stood near the hallway, body angled forward now, his ears rigid, eyes locked, not on Caleb, not on the computer, on the window, the one facing the driveway. Caleb turned. At first nothing, then a shape, a gleam of tinted glass between the trees. The sound followed seconds later, soft, subtle. Tires crunching gravel. Controlled speed, not fast, not aggressive, deliberate. A black SUV pulled up to the edge of the clearing, engine still running, lights off. No markings, no plates, just the hum of idle power. Knight moved before Caleb did, not frantically, not barking. He crossed the room like a shadow, stepping onto the rug in front of the door, positioning himself between Caleb and the window. Body low, head forward, muscles tight beneath healing skin. And then the growl. Low, deep, not noise. Warning. Caleb took a slow breath. I see it too. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out, tall, average build, clean-shaven, nondescript in the way professionals are trained to be. Black boots, dark jeans, a light jacket zipped just below the collarbone, not a uniform, but uniform in intent. The passenger door opened next. Another man, slightly shorter, bald. He carried something in his hand. Metallic, small, rectangular, a device, a scanner. The first man scanned the cabin. His eyes passed over the porch, the windows. The second swept the device along the edge of the tree line, watching the screen. Knight's growl deepened. Caleb stepped back from the window, slow and silent, grabbing the .45 he kept tucked inside a drawer beneath the kitchen counter. He didn't raise it, just held it at his side. For now. They're not with animal control, he muttered. Knight didn't blink. Caleb moved to the back of the cabin, watching from a second window as the bald man raised the scanner, pointing it toward the house. The screen on the device lit up with a soft green glow. He said something. Caleb couldn't hear it, but the message was clear. They found something, or someone. The first man nodded, tapped his earpiece. Then, without a word, began walking slowly toward the porch. Knight stepped closer to the door, his body now angled, weight balanced on 3 legs, the fourth still recovering but steady. It wasn't fear. It was readiness. His breathing was calm, focused. Not a sound outside that growl, not even when the man's boots touched the edge of the porch. Caleb pulled back the safety on the .45, just loud enough for the click to carry. The man paused at the door, his hand hovering just short of knocking. He didn't knock. He waited, then leaned in, speaking just loud enough to cut through the wood. You have something that belongs to a closed program. We're here for the recovery. Caleb said nothing. The silence stretched. We don't want trouble, the voice continued. Just compliance. Inside, Knight didn't move, but his tail had stopped even its minimal twitching. His head now level with the door, teeth visible beneath a curled lip. Caleb glanced down. This wasn't the growl of a scared animal. This was recognition. Back door, Caleb whispered. Knight pivoted on command, almost too fast for a dog still healing. Caleb moved with him, both of them slipping through the rear of the cabin, out onto the unlit path that led into the woods behind the property. Leaves crackled beneath boots. Caleb didn't look back. He didn't have to. He knew 2 things. The men weren't here for answers. Knight wasn't the only thing being tracked. They moved fast but silent, ducking under low-hanging branches, navigating the path to the old service truck parked under camouflage netting 30 yards out. As they reached it, Caleb popped the lock and climbed in. Knight leapt into the passenger side without hesitation. Engine on, lights off. They pulled onto the back road and disappeared into the trees. Behind them, at the edge of the cabin, the black SUV remained. The scanner beeped again. The man with the earpiece listened, then turned toward the forest. He said nothing, but the look on his face said enough. They weren't leaving empty-handed. The second Caleb heard boots hit the porch, he stopped thinking. Instinct took over, not panic training. He moved fast, controlled, grabbing the duffel by the door and slinging it over one shoulder. The .45 stayed in his hand. His other hand motioned to Knight. Back trail. Now. No leash, no hesitation. Knight moved with him, quiet and low, like he'd done it before, because he had. Not here, not in these woods, but somewhere colder, somewhere darker. They slipped through the rear exit and into the thicket just as the front door knob jiggled. No voices now, just pressure. Caleb led the way, ducking beneath hanging moss and slipping past the deer gate he'd left unlatched for this very reason. The trail behind his cabin wasn't on any map. It used to be an old smuggler's cut from the Prohibition days, long since forgotten. He'd maintained it not for nostalgia, but for escape. He didn't believe in coincidence anymore. Knight's body moved like water behind him, low, smooth, deadly, silent. Even with a limp, the dog navigated roots and uneven ground better than most men could. They reached the old truck in under 5 minutes. Camouflaged beneath canvas and pine branches, it sat like a ghost, silent, loyal, waiting. Caleb ripped the cover back with one hand, flung open the driver's door, and Knight leapt into the passenger seat without needing a command. Good. Caleb shoved the duffel onto the floorboards, tossed the .45 onto the dash, and twisted the ignition. The truck coughed, groaned, then caught. He didn't waste a second. Gravel scattered as the wheels tore out of the clearing and onto the hidden back trail that wove through the underbrush like a forgotten artery. Branches slapped the windshield, mud churned beneath tires. The sky above was a blanket of shifting gray, the last light of afternoon smothered by an incoming front. They were running, but not blind. Caleb kept one hand on the wheel and one eye on the mirror, nothing behind them yet. But that didn't mean they were safe. "Talk to me," he muttered under his breath, not expecting an answer, but needing to fill the silence. Knight sat upright in the seat beside him, body facing forward, head turning slightly with each bend in the road, scanning. That was the thing. He didn't look like a dog running for his life. He looked like a soldier back on patrol. Caleb gritted his teeth and pressed harder on the gas. The road narrowed, really more of a trail now, and the shocks groaned as they hit a small rise and dropped into a ravine. He knew where he was headed. An old diver's cove he used to train at, barely marked on state maps, accessible only by water or foot. Remote, forgotten, safe, at least for now. As they barreled over the last bend, Caleb spared a glance at the dog beside him. Knight's eyes weren't darting like prey. They were locked on the horizon, and somehow that made Caleb's grip on the wheel tighten, because that kind of focus wasn't learned in a kennel. That was the look of someone who expected pursuit. Half an hour later, they hit a break in the trees and crossed into marshy lowland, damp, thick and heavy, with the scent of moss and salt. The truck rumbled across a rotting wood plank bridge. Caleb had reinforced himself years ago. Beyond it, the path split off into packed dirt and flattened grass. There it was, the shed, rusty, half sunken into the bluff, but still standing. He killed the engine. Silence fell like a curtain. not peaceful, just suspended. Caleb stepped out first, scanning the tree line. Nothing but cicadas and the sound of water breathing nearby. Night leapt out after him and stood still, nose in the wind, tail still. No wag, no whine, just waiting. Caleb opened the shed, revealing a dusty interior lined with old fishing gear, coiled rope, and a cot covered in an army blanket. He yanked the tarp off an old outboard skiff buried in the rear corner and gave it a hard pat. Still here, still ready. "We'll rest tonight," he said. "Then we move." Night padded inside, turned once, and lay down near the threshold. Not deep inside, facing the door. Always the door. Caleb stood over him for a long second, watching the dog's chest rise and fall, then dropped his bag onto the floor and sat down beside him. He didn't ask if Night was okay. He knew better. Instead, he whispered the truth that had been swelling in his chest since the moment they fled. "They didn't just want you gone." Night looked at him. No sound, no movement. "They wanted you erased." Caleb leaned back against the wooden wall, the cool air wrapping around them both. "But we're not letting that happen." The road ended long before the map said it would, but Caleb knew better. This wasn't a place marked by GPS or mile markers. This was the kind of sanctuary you only found when you were running from the world and no longer cared if it ever found you again. The truck crawled to a stop on a rise overlooking the coastline, just as the first pinks and oranges of dusk bled into the water. Below them, hidden by rock and overgrown brush, was a stretch of coastline that didn't exist on any travel brochure. No signs, no footprints, just cliffs, tide-worn docks, and the skeletal remains of a once bustling diver's station, swallowed now by time, salt, and sea. Night stood in the truck bed, ears scanning the horizon. He hadn't barked once the entire ride. Not even when Caleb took the sharp turns that flung loose pebbles into the trees, or when the scent of smoke from distant cabins drifted into the cab. He knew they were being watched, but he also knew when they weren't. And here it was different, still, breathing, safe, for now. Caleb stepped out, gravel crunching beneath his boots. The air smelled like rusted anchors and forgotten stories. Night jumped down beside him, landing solid despite the stiffness still lingering in his hind leg. "You remember this place?" Caleb asked softly, almost to himself. Night didn't respond. But he stepped forward. That was enough. They descended on foot, through tangled underbrush and a series of rock steps half swallowed by moss. Caleb parted the vines with practiced hands. Muscle memory took over. These were trails he hadn't walked in years, but they still knew him. The tide pool glimmered on the right, catching the last bits of light. To the left, the edge of the collapsed boathouse jutted from the sand like the ribs of a long-dead creature. In the middle, surrounded by thick growth, stood the shack. It leaned just slightly to the west, wooden beams weathered silver-gray by the salt air. The door creaked when Caleb pushed it open, the hinges still stubborn but not broken. Inside, a cot, an oil lamp, old water canisters, a rusted rack where wetsuits used to hang, a dive chart still pinned to the wall with thumbtacks that had turned green with age. Caleb set the duffel down in the corner and lit the lamp. The flame flared, flickered, then settled into a low, steady glow. Night paced once around the perimeter, sniffing the corners, checking each exit. No tension in his body. Just that same silent vigilance Caleb had come to recognize as not just training, but instinct. "You can relax," Caleb said. This place hasn't seen a soul since I left the Navy." Knight paused near the back window and sat, head tilted slightly toward the sea, listening. Caleb crouched, opened the duffel, and pulled out a small tin of sardines. Not gourmet, but enough. He poured clean water into a metal bowl, then placed the food beside it. Knight approached, not cautiously. Just on his terms. He drank first, then ate. Caleb sat against the wall, arms resting on his knees, watching the waves beyond the cracked window frame. The tide was low now, exposing jagged rocks that used to anchor training buoys. He remembered the drills, the cold water, the nights he and his team would sit around a rusted barrel fire, swapping lies and bruises and sea stories, back when he still believed in orders, in missions that meant something. Knight licked the tin clean and walked over, lying beside him without a sound. Just settled in. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to trust. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was shared, worn like a blanket over two souls carrying more than they could say. "You're not just hiding," Caleb murmured. "You're recovering." Knight's eyes didn't close, but they softened. That night, the cove was bathed in moonlight. Caleb stood outside under a sky full of salt-scattered stars, the air crisp with ocean breath. He looked down at the diver's shack and the faint flicker of the lamp still glowing inside. Knight was silhouetted in the doorway, head low, eyes scanning the cliffs. But there was no growl, no tension, just presence. Somewhere, out there in the dark, men were searching, scanners in hand, orders in ear, boots on roads. But they wouldn't find this place, not tonight, maybe not ever. Caleb took a deep breath and walked back toward the door, gravel crunching softly beneath his steps. Knight didn't move. He just watched, waited, guarded. And for the first time in days, Caleb allowed himself a thought that hadn't crossed his mind since pulling that half-dead dog from the water. We might just make it through this. The wind had shifted. Out at sea, it carried the scent of something older than memory salt, rust, and the faint trace of storm. Inside the shack, it whispered through the warped wooden slats like an old song too broken to finish. Caleb stood in the doorway, shoulder against the frame, watching the dog at the edge of the bluff. Knight sat just beyond the threshold of the cove, silhouetted by moonlight, his outline sharp against the silver-black ocean. He didn't move, didn't twitch. He was still, but never relaxed. Always listening, always calculating. Caleb stepped outside, boots crunching gravel, then paused just a few feet behind him. "I don't know how long we have," he said quietly. "Could be days, could be hours." Knight didn't turn, but one ear flicked back at the sound of his voice. "I know what kind of men they send when they want something erased. I've seen them up close. Hell, I was them. Once." The words tasted bitter. He crouched slowly, resting his forearms on his knees. The ocean breeze lifted the edge of his jacket, revealing the faded tattoo on his inner forearm. A set of coordinates. A name scratched out. All that remained from a mission that went sideways and never made it into the record. "You weren't supposed to survive," he said. "And now that you have, they won't let it stand." Finally, Knight turned his head, only slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. And Caleb knew then, this wasn't just a stray dog. This wasn't even just a soldier. This was a witness, Someone who had seen something they weren't meant to, someone they couldn't silence because they'd already tried, and he was still here, still alive. Caleb stood up and walked to the path that led away from the cove, the one road out. It twisted through the dunes, cut across a dried creek bed, and disappeared into scrubland that could lead them anywhere. Or nowhere. He looked down at the sand, then glanced back over his shoulder. Night hadn't moved. "This is where it splits," Caleb said. "I'm not going to leash you. I'm not going to lock you down. You don't owe me anything." He stepped aside, making space between himself and the trail. "You can walk away. I won't stop you." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was sacred. The kind of silence that forms when two damaged things are deciding whether they'll carry each other or vanish alone. Night stared at him for a long time. No whine, no bark, just breath and bone and eyes like the edge of memory. Then he rose. One step, then another, not toward the trail, toward Caleb. He moved slowly, deliberately, his posture tall and even like a soldier reporting to his post. When he reached Caleb's side, he didn't stop. He stepped forward again, then pivoted slightly, and stood between Caleb and the trail, not facing the path forward, guarding it. Caleb swallowed. "You sure?" Knight's head lifted. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. Something unspoken settled into the space between them. Not obedience, not ownership, something older, something earned, a pact, not made with words, made with presence. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded strip of cloth torn from one of his old Navy packs, sun-faded and frayed along the edges. He knelt and looped it gently around Knight's neck. Not tight, not like a collar, just a mark. "You're not a number," he said softly. "You're not a code." He tied it off. It fluttered lightly in the wind. "You're not theirs." Knight stood still, body steady, letting it happen. A gull cried overhead, then silence returned. Only the sound of wind through seagrass and the distant rhythm of the tide remained. Together they turned and walked back toward the shack. No commands, no leash, just two survivors stepping into the dark with the quiet knowledge that, whatever came next, they wouldn't be facing it alone. The storm broke 2 nights after they arrived at the cove. Not the kind that comes screaming with thunder or howling with wind, but the kind that creeps in low and heavy, rolling across the sea like a forgotten memory, soaking everything in silence. Caleb stood at the edge of the dock with a flashlight in hand, watching the horizon vanish under sheets of rain. The beam of light cut across the water, caught nothing but mist. Still, he swept the cove every few minutes, habit, not fear. Behind him, inside the shack, Night moved without a sound, not pacing, not restless, scanning, every room before entering, every corner before lying down, every surface, sniffed not like a curious dog, but like someone reading a story written in scent. It was the way he moved that started to get to Caleb. Not just the silence, the sequencing, door frame, window, floorboard, sweep left, sweep right, then settle. It was the same pattern every time. No wasted steps, no distraction, a loop, a protocol. Caleb had seen it before, but never from anything on 4 legs. That evening, thunder cracked once overhead. A hard, sharp whip of sound that startled the birds from the cliffs and rattled the roof of the shack. Knight didn't flinch, didn't lift his head, didn't even twitch his ears. But 20 minutes later, as the low, distant thump of a helicopter echoed across the sea, barely more than a suggestion of sound, Knight froze, eyes locked on the sky, body tensed, not fear, recognition. He stood and moved to the door, but not in a panic. He pressed himself low to the ground, positioned beneath the threshold, and waited. Watching, calculating. It hit Caleb like cold water. Thunder? Nothing. Helicopter barely audible. Full alert. It didn't make sense unless... Caleb stepped outside, squinting up at the sky. The storm clouds made it hard to see, but he caught a flicker, a red pulse light, far out and low. Not a passenger chopper, not Coast Guard, military. He stepped back inside. Knight was already beside the rear wall, scanning through the slats. "You're not a tracker," Caleb murmured. Knight looked at him, still tense, ears flicking with precision to the rhythm of the blades. "You're not even just a soldier." Knight shifted his weight from paw to paw, slow, controlled, not pacing, preparing. That's when it all started clicking. The way Knight never barked, the way he didn't eat until he'd checked the perimeter, the way he didn't drink until Caleb drank first. He wasn't just trained to respond. He was trained to lead recon, to survive without a handler, to evaluate threats, to avoid exposure, to memorize movement patterns, to be the eyes and ears of a team that might never return. A ghost, built to go where no man could go and return with everything but scars. Later that night, Caleb dug through his duffel and pulled out an old K-9 mission brief from a defunct Marine detachment, a folder marked Phase Protocols. He skimmed through pages of outdated conditioning programs, scent drills, water extraction procedures. And then he found it. Tier 3, Tactician. K-9, Behavioral Indicators, Delayed Response to Vocal Commands, Hyper-attuned to Aerial Disturbances, Exhibits Spatial Memory Patterns in Indoor Environments, Prioritizes Handler Protection from Unknown Quadrants, Refrains from vocalizing unless pain or lethal threat may exhibit PTSD mirroring behaviors consistent with human special forces. Veterans. Caleb let the page fall to his lap. His throat went dry. They hadn't just trained Knight to find people, they trained him to outlive people, to carry intelligence, to function deep behind enemy lines, to remember, and to never speak of what he saw. Unless you choose to, Caleb whispered. He looked at the dog again. Knight had returned to his place by the doorway, back to the wall, eyes on the entry point. His breathing slow, even, waiting for the next move, not like a pet waiting for a command, like a tactician waiting for the mission to resume. And for the first time since pulling him from the ocean, Caleb felt it fully, not just awe, not just curiosity, but the weight of what this dog had survived, and what it meant to walk beside him now. Because this wasn't just about secrets anymore. This was about someone they'd built to be disposable, who refused to be erased. And now, he wasn't alone. The wind had dropped to a whisper outside the shack, but inside, something colder had begun to stir. Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor, the military laptop balanced across his knees like a relic unearthed too early. Knight lay nearby, not asleep, but still. His eyes half-lidded, ears twitching every so often as if listening to things far beyond the cabin walls. It was nearing 3 a.m., and the glow from the laptop cast long shadows against the wooden beams. Caleb had reconnected the hardline modem to the emergency uplink hidden beneath the floorboards. No wireless, no trace. His fingers moved with practiced caution, bypassing familiar security walls, ones he hadn't touched in over a decade. Each keystroke wasn't just a passcode. It was a memory, a step back into a system designed for ghosts. And then he was in. Not into the central DoD archives, but the black shell interface behind it, the one most people didn't know existed. The one for programs that didn't technically exist. A blinking cursor. A file name. Silent Echo VAI 13. Caleb opened it. The screen flooded with redacted blocks, strings of encrypted metadata, and mission reports labeled non-human operative field logs. He clicked through, each line revealing more of a picture that had been carefully buried beneath layers of plausible deniability. And then one document opened clean. Not a log, not an order, a briefing. Project Silent Echo. Asset K9K designation. Tier 3. Animal operative. Breed German Shepherd. Sex male. Status field active. Presumed lost. Phase 5. Deployment. Method deep sea submersible insertion. DSSI VTAR 6. Target. Theater, Offshore Recon, Long-Range Surveillance Command, Override Code, Redacted, Biobehavioral Conditioning, Complete Vocal Response, Suppressed Memory, Encoding, Visual Pattern, Retention, Emotional Trigger Recall. Handler. Notes. Shows exceptional resilience to sensory deprivation, no sedation required, performs perimeter sweeps autonomously. Accepts orders from verified tone imprint only. Psychological risk. Low recovery protocol. NNA final directive if compromised. No recovery protocol. Caleb stared at the screen for a long time, then read that last line again. No recovery protocol. His chest tightened. Not from surprise, but from the confirmation of something he hadn't wanted to believe. They hadn't lost Knight. They had abandoned him. He wasn't presumed dead by mistake. He was meant to disappear. Dropped into the ocean, deployed on some recon mission likely outside the bounds of Geneva or sanity, and left behind when it didn't go as planned. Because even $1 million canine asset is cheaper than a political scandal. Caleb rubbed his hands down his face. Jesus, boy. Knight didn't stir, but Caleb swore he saw the dog's eyes open just a little wider, as if he knew. Maybe he did. Maybe some part of him remembered every dark mile beneath the waves. Every moment trapped in pressure and steel, every flash of light from a submersible that never returned, and worst of all, the absence, the nothing, the knowing no one was coming back. Caleb leaned in and pulled up the mission logs attached to the final deployment. Nothing but garbled coordinates and encrypted telemetry data that had been half deleted, half scrambled. But one line at the top hadn't been wiped. Mission objective. Observe and report. No capture, no engagement, no return window scheduled. He felt sick. Knight hadn't failed. He'd completed the mission. He had observed. He had survived. He had returned. And the only thing waiting for him was silence. Until now. Caleb stood slowly and walked over to the makeshift table. He poured water into a cup and stared through the crack in the wood at the ocean, now black and glassy in the moonlight. It stretched out there like a graveyard, and Knight had swum through it. 300 kilometers. No beacon, no food, no gear, no voice calling him back. Just instinct, and something deeper, a will that defied every protocol they'd written. Caleb turned back and looked at the dog. Knight raised his head. not fast, just enough to meet his gaze. "You weren't supposed to come home," Caleb said softly. Knight blinked once, slow, steady, then turned back toward the door, eyes fixed on the shadows just beyond it. Watching, still watching, because some part of him knew they weren't done yet. It began with a sound too low for human ears to fully register, just a tremble in the bones, a vibration in the ribs, like the earth holding its breath. Then the rhythm sharpened. Whump, whump, whump. Caleb snapped his head up from the terminal. The sound was familiar, terrifyingly so. He didn't need confirmation. He stepped to the doorway of the shack and looked up past the wind-stirred palms and jagged cliffs that framed the cove. There it was, small, black, fast. A military chopper, hugging the coastline with surgical precision. No lights, no flare. Just the cold blink of rotors slicing through humid air. Knight was already on his feet, but something was wrong. He wasn't growling. He wasn't braced for combat. He was shaking. Caleb crossed to him instantly, crouching low. "Knight!" No response. The dog's ears were pinned back, not in aggression but in fear. His entire frame trembled, subtle at first, then growing. It wasn't like the tremors of exhaustion or cold. It was something deeper. Cellular memory. A response that had nothing to do with the present and everything to do with what had been burned into him in some hellish undersea program no one was ever meant to survive. "Hey," Caleb said, placing a hand on Knight's side. "Look at me." Knight blinked. His eyes were wide, unfocused. The chopper drew closer. Then Caleb saw it. Not just the fear, the recognition, the sound, the pattern. The shape of the machine silhouetted against the darkening sky. Knight had heard that specific chopper before. He remembered exactly what followed. A low click echoed through the valley. Caleb's head turned sharply toward the cliffs. Movement. Two shadows dropped from the sky, black-clad figures rappelling down from the aircraft, landing on the high ridge above the cove. 1, 2, 3. Then another set, hitting the slope opposite, boots digging into shale. They moved like liquid, fast, silent, synchronized. Too practiced, too clean to be coincidence. This wasn't a search and rescue. This was a containment team, and they were already surrounding the bluff. Caleb's body snapped into motion. He grabbed the duffel, swung it over his back, and yanked the tarp from the concealed weapons chest under the cot. His hands moved with speed born of memory, his own training rekindled by necessity. 45 into the belt holster, combat knife sheathed on thigh. Old field headset battery still good. But more than weapons, he needed options. He turned to Knight, who was still frozen, muscles tensed, breath shallow, every part of him screaming silent warnings. "Hey," Caleb whispered again, louder now. "You're here, not there. Do you hear me?" Knight's eyes flicked to him, brief, desperate. "You're not alone anymore." The dog let out a sound, not a growl, not a whine, just a low rumble, as if his voice had forgotten what it meant to use itself. Outside, the crunch of boots began. They were moving in, not charging, encircling. Whoever they were, they wanted to avoid gunfire, avoid noise, which meant they weren't here to kill, not immediately. They were here to extract, to retrieve what they thought was theirs, and that gave Caleb a small advantage. Time. He moved to the door, eyes darting across the topography. The cliffs gave them natural cover, but not for long. Knight stood at his flank now, stiff, but responsive. "You with me?" Knight didn't nod, didn't whimper. He stepped forward, between Caleb and the open door, guarding. The tremble was still there, but it was buried now, beneath muscle, beneath instinct. It wasn't fear that moved him anymore. It was resolve. The thrum of the chopper slowed rotors adjusting. Caleb could hear clipped commands through the comm units on the cliff, passed in code. He ducked low, scanned the ground, then whispered, "We hold until we see their lead. They won't fire unless they have to." Knight crouched beside him, head low, eyes trained toward the bluff. Then a figure appeared, slightly apart from the others. No mask, no rifle drawn, and in his hand, something small, rectangular. It pulsed once. Knight collapsed. Not unconscious, but down. Eyes wide, legs trembling, body slamming into the earth like gravity had doubled in an instant. "Knight!" Caleb reached for him, but the dog didn't respond, locked in a loop of shivering low groans catching in his throat. His body rebelled against itself like something inside had been switched off or overwritten. The device pulsed again. Caleb looked up and met the eyes of the man holding it. Not cruel, not panicked, just controlled. This wasn't a hunter. This was a handler. And he'd just activated something that had been buried deep inside Knight's neural conditioning, something Caleb hadn't known to guard against. Until now. Chapter 7. The Handler. The man stood at the ridge unarmed, expression calm, like a conductor waiting for the orchestra's first deadly note. He wasn't imposing average height, civilian clothes, cropped salt and pepper hair, but every operative around him deferred to his presence. In his hand, a matte black device, no larger than a deck of cards, blinking blue. He pressed it. A faint hum, and Knight collapsed. Not from pain, but something deeper neurological. His limbs spasmed, breath shallow. Caleb dropped beside him, whispering, "You're here. You're safe." But Knight's eyes darted, trapped in some distant memory. The man at the ridge didn't flinch. He adjusted the dial. Knight yelped, a broken sound of both defiance and agony. Caleb's fury flared. He stood, one hand on his sidearm. "Turn it off!" The man replied, too calmly. "No harm intended." "You knew what that would do," Caleb growled. "He's not your dog." The words hit hard. The man raised the device again. "It's not mind control. It's a recall frequency tied to bio-triggered memory paths. He was trained for this. He's not in your program anymore. He never left. That swim? It wasn't loyalty. It was a failsafe. Trauma-triggered behavior. You were just the nearest warm body." Caleb clenched his jaw. The man's voice softened, almost pitying. "You don't know what he carries. Visuals, encoded memories, enough to burn operations you've never heard of." Knight twitched behind them, still struggling. "With time," the man said, "we can stabilize him. Bring him home." Caleb stepped toward Knight, kneeling again. "You trained him like a weapon," he whispered, "but you forgot one thing." The man arched a brow. "What's that?" Caleb placed a hand on Knight's ribs. "You can't erase choice." Knight's gaze met his, no longer panicked, but barely holding on. "You don't have to go back," Caleb said softly. Knight blinked once. Then slowly, shakily, he rose. One paw, then the other. And without a command, he stepped in front of Caleb, trembling but upright, eyes burning with defiance. The man adjusted the dial again. Knight didn't move, didn't fall, just edged closer to Caleb. "Move in," the handler ordered. Two operatives emerged from the cliffs, silent and fast. The first swung a baton at Caleb. He dodged, countered, and dropped him with a strike to the jaw. The second came with a knife but never reached his target. Night launched like a shadow with teeth, slamming the man down, fangs bared inches from his throat. He didn't bite, just pinned. From the ridge the handler commanded, "Stand down, K9K." Knight's head twitched but didn't obey. "Disengage. That's an order." "He's not yours to order," Caleb snapped. The handler's expression cracked. "You've compromised national security," he said. "He holds enough intel to destroy black-level programs." Caleb holstered his weapon not in surrender but in judgment. "Then maybe they need destroying," Knight growled. Final choice made. The handler hesitated, then, tapping the device once more, powered it down. The blue light faded. He raised a hand to his earpiece. "Fall back!" The shadows retreated. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. Caleb turned to Knight. "That's enough." Knight stepped back, controlled, not shaken. "I saw it," Caleb whispered. "What you held back." Knight said nothing, but he didn't need to. His silence spoke not of programming, but of will. Dust floated like smoke from a war that hadn't quite ended. Then the handler stepped forward again. That was enough. A growl rose deep from Knight's chest. He stepped beside Caleb's shoulder, to thigh not guarding but standing with. "You sure?" Caleb asked. Knight didn't answer. He just stayed. "He's not your tool anymore," Caleb called. The handler's voice was colder now. "You're making a mistake." But Caleb had heard that voice before, from men who couldn't stand what they couldn't control. The last injured operative rose. No retaliation, no fight. Just a nod from the handler. Then silence, punctuated by 2 whistles. Extraction. Shadows disappeared, swallowed by the sky. Knight watched them vanish, steady and still. Wind brushed his coat like a baptism. Only when they were gone did Caleb exhale. He dropped to one knee, fingers brushing Knight's back. "I saw what they tried to bury, but I saw what you did too. You chose." Knight turned. Their eyes met. No bark, no wag, just presence. Later, as they walked back to the cabin in silence, the trail felt different, not safer, but clearer. Knight walked beside Caleb. No leash, no command, just a bond earned in battle, not of bullets, but of spirit. At the clearing, Caleb paused. The sun was setting behind them, the ocean calm again. Knight looked back once toward the ridge, toward the ghosts, then turned away, for good. Gravel crunched under Caleb's boots as twilight draped the treetops in golden light. For the first time in days, the air was still. No chopper hum, no shadows on the ridge, just the ocean's distant whisper. Knight walked beside him, not tense, not scanning, just walking, free. At the porch, Caleb held the screen door open. Knight paused, not from hesitation, but choice, then stepped inside. The cabin hadn't changed, but it felt warmer. Where silence had once been heavy, now it felt shared. Knight curled up on the old blanket, not braced, just resting. Caleb knelt, unzipping a cooler bag. "I got you the good stuff," he murmured, setting out rice and chicken. Not rations, not orders, just dinner. Knight sniffed, then began to eat, slowly, steadily. Not surviving, living. When he finished, he sat in front of Caleb and let out a soft sigh, like someone realizing they could finally rest. Caleb extended his hand. Knight pressed his head into it, no command, just trust. Later, under moonlight, Caleb found an old rubber ball from his Navy days. He tossed it lightly outside. Knight hesitated, processing, then jogged after it. Not for duty, for himself. They played beneath the stars. Slow throws, quiet joy, no drills, just a man and a dog. Night eventually stretched out nearby, paws twitching, not from fear, but dreams. Caleb whispered, "You look different tonight." Night didn't move, but his ear flicked toward the voice. He was listening, not as a soldier, but something more. A friend. The next morning they visited a dusty pet shop on the edge of town. No leash, no resistance. Night stayed at Caleb's side like it was where he belonged. Behind the counter stood Linda, a woman in her 60s. "That him?" she asked, eyes wide. Caleb nodded. Linda didn't press. Small towns know how to read silence. Night sniffed the floor, then a bin of tennis balls. Calm, curious. "He doesn't carry fear in his feet anymore," Linda observed. "Not as much," Caleb agreed. Linda disappeared, then returned with a weathered leather collar. "Made it years ago for a shepherd who never made it. He should have it." Caleb knelt. "You okay with this?" Knight stepped forward, bowed his head. Not submission permission. The collar clicked into place. Perfect fit. The silver nameplate glinted in the dusty light. Knight. "It's not about being a fighter," Linda said. "It's about loyalty, standing for something." "Yeah," Caleb nodded. "It fits him." Knight's tail gave the faintest wag. Not fast, but real. That evening, the sky was brushed in orange and lavender, as if the world was trying to apologize. Caleb walked barefoot on the beach, ball tucked under his arm. Night beside him, no tension, just presence. The first time they'd walked here, Night had flinched at every wave. The sea had been a threat, not tonight. Tonight he stood at the water's edge, letting it pass. Caleb tossed the ball. Night watched, then ran, not from training, from choice. He pounced, fetched it, trotted back, not to deliver it, just carrying it. They played, slow throws, soft returns. Caleb crouched, rubbing Knight's side. "You got the moves of a rookie, but the soul of a legend." Knight huffed, dropped the ball. They walked the shoreline in silence. At one point, Knight stopped, staring out toward the reef where Caleb had first seen him, just a shadow paddling toward life. Now? He stood whole. Caleb placed a hand on his head. "Some never make it back. But you did not just your body. Your heart, too." Knight leaned into the touch. Not a weapon, not an asset, but Knight, wearing a collar with a name, not a number. When they turned toward home, Knight carried the ball not because he had to, because he wanted to. A small joy, and proof that sometimes the greatest rebellion is choosing to live. The night was still, too still. Caleb sat at the old desk by the cabin window, a steaming mug of black coffee untouched beside him. Outside, the moonlight glinted off the surf. Night lay curled up near the fireplace, snoring softly, no longer the restless, watchful shell he had once been. It should have felt safe, because something had been gnawing at Caleb's mind for days now. Not paranoia, not fear, instinct, the kind that never fully switches off in men who've spent too long in war zones. And tonight, that instinct told him the story wasn't over. He slid the laptop out from under the false floorboard and wiped the dust from the casing. Still dented at the hinge, still holding secrets no one was supposed to unearth again. He powered it on. The boot-up sequence crackled to life, stuttering through half-broken drivers and outdated protocols. Caleb exhaled slowly, waiting. The login screen blinked once, then again. He entered the credentials. There was a pause longer than usual, then the screen flickered. A command window opened. Access granted Level 3. Clearance. Echo node reconstruct. Caleb leaned in, frowning. That wasn't supposed to happen. He hadn't triggered a scan. He hadn't gone digging. But the system was reconstructing itself files, self-replicating from corrupted backups, like something buried, clawing its way back. The progress bar climbed, glitchy, relentless. He opened the folder labeled Silent Echo, Retrieval Assets. Inside, there was more than he remembered. A lot more. K9K, status, presumed lost. Contact reestablished. K9D, status, deactivated. K9R, status, non-responsive. K9M, status, unknown. K9O, status, compromised. K9N, status, reprogrammed, failure. K9L, status, recovered. Unstable. Caleb's heart stilled. Knight wasn't the only one. He had feared really that the government never invested in a single animal asset. But seeing their designations, rows of them, each one marked with clinical detachment, was like being hit with a second betrayal. These weren't pets. They weren't partners. They were experiments. And at least 3 were still active. He opened one file at random, K9M. Photos, logs, training data. A Malinois, smaller than Knight but just as sharp-eyed. Operative summary. Coastal infiltration. Deep dive tolerance 400 mil. Recovered twice from hostile fire. Declared untraceable 6 months ago. Last note in the file. Do not attempt retrieval. Compromised memory banks may contain field-level visual encryption. Caleb leaned back in the chair, the knot in his chest tightening. Knight hadn't just been trained, he had been loaded. Trained to recognize, react to, and potentially record classified material through scent, behavior, and eyes trained on command-specific targets. This wasn't obedience, it was weaponized memory. A soft whine stirred the silence. Caleb turned. Knight had lifted his head, ears tilted back, gaze focused on the laptop like he could feel it. Not the files, not the words, but the weight of them. Like echoes through bone. You feel that too, don't you? Caleb whispered. Knight blinked slowly. Didn't move, didn't look away. A chill passed through Caleb. Not from fear, from clarity. They're not after you, he murmured. They're after what's in you. He closed the laptop and pressed the lid shut with a quiet finality. There was no more denying it now. Knight hadn't just escaped. He hadn't just survived. He had brought something back with him, something they couldn't afford to lose, something they'd come for again. But next time, Caleb wouldn't just be a man trying to protect a dog. He'd be a witness holding the truth, and a soldier with a mission. The cursor blinked. The screen had been idle for 5 minutes, but Caleb hadn't moved. His hands hovered over the keyboard, cold from stillness, his mind spinning. Knight hadn't shifted either. The dog sat like a stone sculpture by the fireplace, eyes alert, but unreadable, as if he, too, sensed the laptop wasn't done talking. Then, without input, the screen flashed white. A terminal window opened on its own. Caleb's instincts kicked into high gear. He reached for the power button, but stopped when 4 words bled into view. typed one character at a time. "They'll come again." He froze. Another line followed. "Not for him." His breath caught. Then came the third. "For what he saw." The cursor blinked once more, and then disappeared. The screen went black. Caleb stared into the void. Not for him, not for the dog. For what he saw. That line repeated in his head like an alarm. Whatever Knight had witnessed, it wasn't just sensory. It was stored, encoded, maybe even activated under the right conditions. But by who? How? And why leave a message now after silence for weeks? He opened the laptop again, hands steady despite the rising pulse in his throat. But the folder was gone. The entire Silent Echo directory erased, as if it had never existed. In its place, in the root directory, sat a single file. Visual Echo Move. He clicked. The video began in darkness. A narrow field of view. Movement fast, fluid, disorienting. First-person perspective low to the ground. Wind, water, gravel. Then voices, muffled and distorted as if underwater. The screen jerked. Stopped. A face came into view, blurred, distorted by gear and goggles. But behind the man stood something unmistakable. A steel hatch, half submerged in seawater, labeled with a 3-digit number and no words. Knight had seen this, had followed this man, had watched this door open. And what lay inside? Caleb hit pause. His mouth was dry. Knight wasn't trained just to navigate terrain. He'd been used to record and track high-level installations without cameras, without tech. His mind was the storage. His memory the vault. Encrypted, trained visually. And somehow, somewhere along the way, he had been compromised enough to escape. Now the question wasn't whether Knight remembered. It was whether the ones who built him knew he still did, and if they did, they wouldn't stop coming. A sudden breeze rattled the window. Caleb turned, heart pounding, but it was just wind. Knight had stood now, slowly, padding toward the desk. He sat beside Caleb, gaze fixed on the laptop screen as if he understood, as if the images had stirred something buried deep inside the architecture of his trained mind. Caleb reached down, resting a hand on his head. Knight didn't flinch. "Did you know what you were carrying?" Caleb asked quietly. Knight's eyes met his, unwavering. Not an answer, but not a denial either. "I don't care," Caleb added. "You're not alone in this. Whatever they put in you, whatever they want, you're not going back." The dog leaned gently into his leg. A silent affirmation, not as a handler, not as a soldier, but as a man and a dog, bound by something unbreakable. Outside the wind grew stronger, but inside the cabin, something else had solidified. Resolve. Because now Caleb knew this wasn't just about protecting Knight. It was about what Knight had unknowingly become, a carrier of knowledge, meant to stay buried. A witness to secrets too dangerous for any one being to hold. And they weren't done hunting him. But next time, they wouldn't be the only ones prepared. Caleb sat hunched at the kitchen table, the surface scattered with papers, thumb drives, and maps so old their edges curled like dried leaves. The cabin was quiet, except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the rhythmic scratching of his pencil. Knight lay nearby, head on his front paws, watching every movement, not just observing, studying. It was a stillness that spoke of focus, not tension, like he sensed something was changing. On the table lay the beginnings of something dangerous, a dossier, names, dates, Project Echo, K9K, naval test programs with no public record, a list of handlers, some crossed out, some marked unknown, satellite coordinates tied to offshore structures that didn't exist. Caleb clicked open a folder on his laptop and dragged in the visual files Knight had captured. He paused at one frame the door from the video. The blurred numeric code. He sharpened the image manually, enhancing layer by layer. There it was, 300 Sensfin A. He scribbled it down, then highlighted it. Across the page, in bold ink, he wrote, "This wasn't just surveillance. This was containment." A sudden gust of wind shook the windows. Caleb looked up. Knight didn't move. He just kept staring at him, like waiting, like listening. "You were trained to find ghosts," Caleb said softly, "but they didn't count on you becoming one." Knight's tail thudded once against the floor. Quiet. Intentional. Caleb stood and walked to the fire, feeding it another log, then turned back toward the table. "They're not done. And we won't be either." He pulled a small GoPro from a drawer, checked its battery, then another, then the old camcorder he used to film training clips a lifetime ago. All of it would go into the file. Voice memos, satellite overlays, thermal scans, local marine radar logs the night he found Knight. He'd already pulled them from the Coast Guard's old public access archive. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to start telling the truth. The kind that didn't scream. The kind that whispered until it couldn't be ignored. Knight stood now, slowly, and walked over to him. He nudged the laptop once, then looked at Caleb. "You think this'll stop them?" Caleb asked. Knight didn't blink, didn't answer. But in his stance, in the calm weight of his gaze, was an unspoken agreement. This wasn't about stopping. This was about revealing. Caleb turned back to the table. He opened a fresh folder on the desktop. Shadow Doc 01. Then a second. Echo leak. Redacted copy. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. "If they come again," he said quietly, half to himself, half to the dog, "we won't run." Knight stepped beside him. Caleb reached down, scratched gently behind his ear. "We'll shine a light." Outside, the sky had darkened completely, but in the cabin, the fire glowed warm, the laptop fan hummed like a low heartbeat, and on the table between them, man and dog rested something more powerful than any weapon they'd carried in their past lives: proof, and the will to expose it. The camera clicked on with a faint hum. A red light blinked once recording. Caleb didn't speak immediately. He sat still in front of the lens, shoulders square, eyes steady, not like a man about to confess, but like someone preparing a final will. There were shadows under his eyes, not from exhaustion, but from clarity. The kind that only comes after weeks of pretending you're safe when you know you're not. Knight lay just behind him, not in frame, but close enough that Caleb could hear the steady breath. That was enough. He looked into the lens and began. "My name is Caleb Morris, former Navy, handler, Tier 3 K9 Recon, retired." He could hear the clock ticking behind him, hear the wind brush the cabin's walls like a whisper. "I wasn't supposed to see what I saw. And the dog who sits behind me, he wasn't supposed to come back." He reached toward the table and held up a rusted metal tag. The single letter engraved on it, K, caught the firelight. They called him K9K, classified, disposable, forgotten. He placed the tag down gently. "His real name is Knight, and this," Caleb tapped the hard drive beside him, "is everything they didn't want you to know." The footage began playing in the background on a secondary screen, already rolling. Knight swimming alone in open water, near death. Recon satellite data from the night of his rescue. Clips pulled from Silent Echo's buried logs. And finally, the blurry video Knight had captured through his trained visual memory images of a submerged hatch, ghost operatives, and weapons sealed where maps showed nothing. "Some of you watching this won't believe it," Caleb said into the lens. "Some of you won't care." He leaned forward. "But someone will." Knight stirred behind him, ears twitching. Not out of alarm, out of recognition. Caleb reached back without turning, resting a hand on the thick fur at Knight's side. They trained him to forget pain, to suppress fear, to execute commands without hesitation, but they didn't train him to survive what he survived. A silence passed. A different weight entered his voice. They didn't count on him remembering. The video cut to black. The next frame, a time stamp, a folder tree, metadata logs that no one should have. Caleb spoke again. "This isn't just a story about a dog or a soldier. It's about what happens when the people meant to protect us decide their secrets are worth more than our lives." His throat tightened, but he didn't break. He let the pause hang like a verdict. "If you're watching this, then I probably didn't get to finish what I started. But you can." He looked into the camera eyes hard, heart visible. "Don't let them bury him again." He reached forward and turned off the camera. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. Knight stepped into frame, head resting on Caleb's thigh. No orders, no training, just a dog who remembered enough to choose who he wanted to be. Caleb whispered, "It's out there now, buddy. No going back." Knight didn't blink, didn't move. But in his stillness was every answer Caleb needed. The war might not be over. But now, the world would know it existed. The sun bowed low over the horizon, bleeding gold into the Atlantic. It painted the waves in molten amber and turned the salt-laced wind into something softer, almost warm. Gulls circled lazily overhead, their cries distant and faint, like memories fading into the foam. Caleb walked the beach with his boots in one hand, the other resting gently on the back of the German shepherd, trotting beside him. Knight's paws padded through the sand without hesitation. No tension, no flinching, only presence, only peace. They reached the same driftwood log where Caleb had sat the morning after the rescue, back when Knight could barely stand, let alone walk, back when trust was still a question. Now the dog leapt lightly onto the log, turned in a slow circle, and curled beside Caleb's feet without a word, without a command. Caleb lowered himself beside him, elbows on his knees, gaze on the orange-lit water. "You made it," he said quietly, not looking down. "Damn if you didn't actually make it." Knight let out a small, breathy huff, almost a laugh, if dogs could laugh. Caleb chuckled under his breath. Then silence returned. But it wasn't empty. It was full of everything they'd lived through. The chopper, the files, the handler, the decision to stay. Everything they hadn't said, but didn't need to. "I know what they turned you into," Caleb said eventually, voice low, steady. "They made you a tool, a shadow." He paused, eyes flicking to the horizon. "But somehow You chose something else." He looked down. Night met his gaze, eyes warm, unblinking, alive. "You saved more than yourself," Caleb whispered. Night pressed his head gently into Caleb's knee. No tension, no urgency, just contact, like he understood, like he agreed. The wind picked up slightly, stirring Caleb's hair, ruffling Night's coat. He reached out and pulled from his pocket a thin leather cord. At the end of it, a small steel, tag-new, polished, engraved by hand. He held it out, not as a handler, not as a soldier, but as a friend. It read, "Night, survivor, protector, free." Caleb fastened it to the collar gently, then scratched behind Night's ear. "No ranks, no commands, just who you are now." Night licked his hand once, then placed his head back on Caleb's boot, tail thumping against the log. The sun dipped lower. The shadows grew longer. But there was no more fear in either of them. Not of the past. Not of the next knock at the door. Not even of what might still come from the files they'd exposed. Because here, on this forgotten stretch of sand, under the dying light of a day they were never supposed to survive, they'd found something stronger than control. Choice. Night looked up once more, then stood and walked a few feet down the shore. Caleb followed. When he threw the ball into the surf, Night sprinted, no hesitation, no instinct for orders, just joy, just freedom. The kettle whistled softly on the stove. Morning light filtered through the cabin's weathered windows, casting a golden glow across the hardwood floor. Dust motes danced in the quiet like memories too gentle to disturb. Caleb poured the hot water over coffee grounds and stirred slowly. Outside, birds were calling. Late spring had brought life back to the trees. Beside the back door, Night lay curled up, eyes half-lidded, tail thudding lazily now and then. No tension in his frame, no nightmares jerking him awake. Just rest. Real rest. The landline rang. An old rotary model barely used, its sudden trill slicing through the morning calm like a relic from another life. Caleb hesitated. Only a few people had that number. He wiped his hand on a dish towel and picked up the receiver. "Yeah?" A pause. Then a calm, clear voice came through. "Mr. Morris, this is Emily Vance, with the Unity Veteran Center in Tallahassee. I hope I'm not calling too early." Caleb straightened slightly. "No, go ahead," she continued, cautiously respectful. "I know this might sound strange, but a video landed in our inbox last night from someone in the PTSD Outreach Network." She didn't have to say what video. He already knew. "It showed a German shepherd," she continued, "one that wasn't supposed to make it back. One that did." Another pause. Caleb glanced down. Night had lifted his head, ears twitching at the tone. "We watched it twice," Emily said. Then again in silence. She exhaled into the line. "We've got men here who haven't spoken in months. They saw him, and they leaned forward." Caleb swallowed. "I'm not saying we believe everything in that footage," she added carefully. "But what we do believe, what we felt, was that this dog, this Night, he has a calm, a presence." She hesitated, then, almost vulnerable. "Would you ever consider bringing him in? Just once? Just to meet a few of our guys?" Caleb said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked down at Night, who had quietly padded to his side, sensing the shift in energy like a compass to storm front. Caleb reached down. Night pressed his head into Caleb's palm. No words, just that same gesture, The same weight, the same understanding. Caleb spoke softly into the receiver. "I'll ask him." There was a chuckle on the other end light, surprised. "Please do." He hung up without promising anything, then turned to Knight, crouched to meet him, eye to eye. "You heard that?" he murmured. Knight tilted his head slightly, not confused, listening. "They want you to help others now," Caleb said. "Not as a soldier, as something else." Knight didn't blink, didn't bark. Instead, he stepped forward and gently nudged Caleb's hand with his nose once, then twice, a choice. Not a command, not an instinct drilled by a handler, but something real, something earned. Caleb smiled and rested his forehead against the shepherd's. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's go show them what survival looks like." They left the next morning. No fanfare, no goodbye. Just a man and a dog in a beat-up truck, headed toward something new. Not to bury the past, but to plant something better in its place. A mission chosen, not assigned. In a world often too quick to discard what it no longer controls, Night is a reminder that healing isn't just possible, it's powerful. He wasn't born a symbol. He became one through endurance, trust, and the quiet miracle of being seen not as a tool, but as a life worth saving. This story isn't just about survival. It's about transformation. It's about a German shepherd who swam through the impossible and a man who knew what it meant to carry invisible wounds. Together, they reminded us that no one is too lost to come home, and that sometimes redemption has 4 legs and doesn't need words to speak. To love animals, especially dogs like Night, is to believe in second chances, in loyalty without conditions, in the silent, steady kind of courage that doesn't make headlines but saves lives every day. And maybe the most powerful mission of all is to choose love again, even after everything tried to teach you fear. Night chose. Caleb answered. And together, they're not just moving forward, they're lighting the way.